Well, about 15 years ago or so, I taught a course at Mundelein Seminary called The Christology of the Poets and Preachers. What I wanted to do was present the Christology of the church, but not in the sort of formal, high theological language of the councils and the theologians, but in the language of the poets and preachers, this more lyrical approach. And I did that course, I'll confess, as a kind of experiment. I wanted to learn about this, so I endeavored to research it. So I read some of the literary people. Dante, for example, has got a very clear Christology. Someone like Chesterton in the 20th century, others. But I also looked at the great preachers. So go all the way back to the 3rd century, and people like Origen, the 4th century, Augustine, come up into the Middle Ages, people like Bernard and Aquinas, come into the relatively modern period, people like Newman, the 20th century, someone like Ronald Knox. I read all these great preachers. Well, here's what struck me. It struck me with extraordinary power in a way that really changed my thinking dramatically. Not one of these figures, whose sermons we especially revere and preserve, preached the way I was taught to preach. Not one. From the 2nd century to the 20th century, not one of them preached the way I was taught to preach. Now, what do I mean? Well, I came of age right after Vatican II. I'm in the seminary in the 70s, 80s. The watchwords of our time were relevance and experience, right? Make the biblical word relevant to people today. Appeal above all to their experience, to your own experience, to make it relevant to them. A lot of our sermons, we were taught to be humorous, to make a lot of references to the culture, a lot of references to our own lives, et cetera, et cetera. Now, mind you, I'm not saying all these sermons were bad. They weren't. I'm not saying this was entirely wrong-headed. It wasn't. But it just struck me as egregious. When you read the great tradition of preachers, not one of them preached in that way. I thought, I wonder, what does that say about them and about us? Well, we were in many ways the inheritors of a tradition that goes back to at least the early 19th century in Protestantism. Someone like Friedrich Schleiermacher said that we have to do a great translation project. Modern people don't understand the Bible. So you have to translate biblical language into the language of experience. Now, Schleiermacher did that in a very high theological way, but he has tons and tons of followers up to the present day. That the job of the theologian or the preacher is to translate the obscure, strange language of the Bible into the language of ordinary experience. All right, as far as it goes, there's something to it, maybe. But what's the danger? The danger is it flattens out and domesticates the biblical world. Because here's the thing now, as I read all these great preachers, from Origen to Ronald Knox, what they tended to do was take their listeners, their readers, on a tour of the biblical world. They didn't engage in a translation project. They took their readers and listeners on a tour of the densely textured world of the Bible. They tried to draw the world of their listeners into the world of the Bible, not vice versa. And that makes all the difference. Let me give you some examples by way of comparison. Look at Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose. That came out the year I was ordained, 1986. The Name of the Rose, of course, is it's a combination detective story. It's a sort of Bildungsroman. It's a coming-of-age story. And it's set in a medieval monastery. Well, he spends an awful lot of time at the beginning introducing you to the ways, the mores, the customs of a medieval monastery. And some people complained to him, saying, well, you get a little too hung up on that. And he said, no. My reader has to go through a kind of monastic novitiate. He has to be brought into this world in this kind of painstaking way in order to grasp the point of my story. Now here, it's very much like something I know I've talked about before, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which is a rollicking adventure story full of battles and energy and all kinds of stuff. But it begins with a very lengthy, about 70-page account of Bilbo Baggins' birthday party. And people wonder, why is he spending so much time with this tiresome birthday party? Well, Tolkien's answer was, very much like Echo's, I need you to know the texture of the world that I'm creating. how people look, how they sound, what the weather is like, what the topography is like. Who are these players from hobbits to orcs to so on and so forth. You got to know my world before you're going to get my story. Don't, in other words, try to turn my world into your world, but may the momentum go in the opposite direction. Similarly, look in the 19th century with Melville's Moby Dick, the great American novel. Many people complain as they try to plow their way through that book that there's lengthy sections about life on a whaling ship in the mid-19th century. And you say, isn't that a little bit much? And no, although Melville never said this, but I think it's implied. I need you to understand this world. If you're going to get the thematics of my novel, you've got to get the dynamics of my world. I think that's now very similar to what good preaching does. It doesn't domesticate the Bible or flatten it out or translate it into our world. Rather, it opens up the biblical world, this strange, surprising, puzzling world filled with odd characters, including the oddest of them all, called the Lord God. But it's only if you get the dynamics of the world that you'll get the thematics of the story. Same idea. Don't translate the Bible into our experience. Draw our experience into the Bible. Don't read the Bible through our lenses, but rather read our world through biblical lenses. Now that's preaching. Which brings me finally to a story I heard from Stanley Hauerwas, the Methodist theologian. He was giving the Gifford lectures over in Edinburgh some years ago. And part of that was he was invited to preach at the Edinburgh Cathedral. And there was a tradition going back to the Reformation that the sexton of the cathedral would literally lock the preacher into the pulpit, one of those old style pulpits with little doors. He'd lock you in, and the sexton would not let you out until you preach the gospel. Now, frankly, I don't subscribe to the 16th century Protestant view of what the gospel is, but I like that instinct. Don't let preachers out of the pulpit until they preach the biblical world. Don't let them do an easy Schleiermacher translation project. Lock them in until they open up for you the biblical world.